A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So, in between us, we have Honorable Minister of Commerce and Industry, Consumer Affairs. All right, so right now in between us, we have Shri Purushottam Rupala ji, Honorable Minister of Fisheries, Animal Husbandry and Trading of India. So, I request everyone to please welcome our Honorable Minister with a big round of applause. मैं माननीय मंत्री जी का बहुत बहुत स्वागत करती हूँ और उनसे निवेदन करती हूँ कि वो अपना स्थान ग्रहण करें. Now with this once again a very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So we are all set for this morning, and we have the next session on sustainable dairy for low environmental impact, and for that I would like to introduce our session chair, Mr. Brian Lindsay, Managing Director of Lindsay Consulting, Gloss, United Kingdom. I request everybody to please welcome our session chair with a big round of applause. Now, I would like to introduce all our session speakers. So, for the first speaker, we have Mr. James, Sustainable Food Systems and Agriculture Program Officer, UNEP. I request him to please come and join us on the stage. I request our next speaker, Mr. Pierre, World Bank, and he'll be giving the virtual presentation. For the next speaker, we have Mr. Greg, Professor from Arkansas University, US. I request him to please come and join us on the stage. Then we have our next speaker, Ms. Anna, Life Cycle Sustainability Manager, Arla Foods, Denmark. I request you, ma'am, to please come and join us. Then we have the next speaker, Ms. Caroline and Mr. Donald. Yes, Ms. Caroline Imonde, IDF Director General, and Mr. Donald, Executive Director of GDP. I request both of you to please come and join us on the stage. And at last, I would like to call upon our last speaker, Mr. Mohan Reddy, Director, Zenith Energy Services Limited from India. Can we have you on the stage? So with this, once again, a very warm welcome to all the speakers and our session chair. Now moving ahead, I would like to hand over the mic to our session chair, Mr. Brain.
Well, good morning everyone, and welcome to the Right Honourable Minister. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. As you can see, sustainability, environmental actions in dairy farming has a lot of interest, and we have a full stage of speakers, quality speakers for you today. We also have speakers online who aren't able to join us here in India, so we have a very full session and a very tight schedule. As a professional chair, I'd like to think that I was fair to my speakers. I asked each one of them for easy questions that I can ask them to make them feel comfortable on stage. Not one of them came back with any easy questions, so I challenge you to challenge them with difficult questions today as punishment for not responding to their chair. Thank you for all coming today. You're the resilient ones, you're the sustainable ones. After last night's activities, wonderful meal, I've seen so many new dance moves that I've never seen before, and thank you for sharing those with us also. With the program today, it's titled Sustainable Dairy and Low Environmental Impact. But you'll see the agenda has a pretty much focus on carbon and climate change. But environment is so much more, and this is something that we keep talking about in dairy. Environment is about water, it's about soil, it's about the air as well. So what we cannot forget, even though today's focus is on climate change and mitigating climate gases, we cannot forget the interactions between the climate and the three pillars of sustainability, of social, economic and environment. So it's important we recognise that. We've got a very full-packed program, as I've already mentioned, and I'd just like to crack on and introduce our first speaker. And we're very lucky today to have Mr. James Lomax from the United Nations Environment Program, a program that we as dairy get involved with through the United Nations Environment Assembly that takes place every second year in Nairobi. Dairy is represented there with the IDF and Global Dairy Platform. We attend these meetings to share with them what dairy is doing. We didn't just start thinking about sustainability last week or before COP26. We've been working on this for many years, and you'll see evidence of that today. So James is currently the Food Systems and Agriculture Advisor in UNEP's Ecosystems Division, having recently been a part-time secondee to the Secretariat of the UN Food Systems Summit, which took place last year, again where dairy was actively involved. James has been leading efforts on sustainable food systems and agriculture in UNEP since 2009. He has pioneered the idea of systems thinking in the food and agriculture sector where nutrition, waste, environmental externalities and livelihoods must be considered, and we've heard those terms used throughout this conference as well, the interactions. We need to move towards more sustainable food systems, and that's the work James is doing. Currently, James is focusing on sustainable agriculture and livestock systems. So James, without further ado, I will hand over to you.
Honourable Minister, distinguished panellists, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here, and despite the dancing from last night, I'm very surprised to see a lot of you here at 8:30 in the morning. I myself thought I would struggle, so thank you very much for coming. Are there some slides to put up? Are there some slides? What do I have to do? Do I have to click that? Aha. Thank you so much. How do I put that back? How do we go back? Great stuff. So listen, I have been asked to come here to really set the tone for this session. Like Brian said, we are in a position where the dairy sector is under stress. The food system is under stress, massive amount of stress. Now, what I would like to do today, if I could just make that happen. Could you go back to the start? What I'd like to do is I'd like to give the context in which UNEP, which is one of the smallest United Nations programs, to give you the context in which we look at food systems and agriculture. Food systems and agriculture is under enormous stress right now. We are in an age of incredible issues when it comes to, you need to go to the first slide, please. Incredible issues when it comes to geopolitical influence, when it comes to global aspects. Thank you very much. Now, we as UNEP, we cannot, there are not many of us in UNEP, so we have to be very particular in how we identify where we want to work, but critically what we have to do is look at the context in which food systems in 2022 are now operating. Now, in February of this year, Russia started the conflict in Ukraine. Now, what does this have to do with food systems? A lot. In the middle of March, I was asked by the Secretary General to work with him directly to discuss how we, as the UN, are going to respond to the food, fuel, and finance crisis, which was exacerbated by this conflict. And this is a slide that we put together that the Secretary General presented to the Security Council in March, and also to the IMF spring meetings. And this is that there are 6 issues that we are facing. The first one is the food price index is at record levels. And I understand, of course, food prices have gone down now, but this was a particular picture in April. Oil is at record levels. Natural gas continues to be a huge issue. Why is natural gas important? It's hugely important when it comes to the production of fertilizer. Maritime trade costs are now 3 times what they were. Interest rates are rising, and prices of fertilizer, prices for fertilizers are also increasing. So that all leads us to start to think, okay, so what is our global food system? Now, our global food system is exactly that, it's globalized. Now, this may not seem particularly relevant to the dairy sector, but I can tell you it very much is. Now we have an inordinate dependence upon these 2 countries, Ukraine and Russia, for our wheat and maize. One of the things that came out very interestingly was that even though there was a crisis in these 2 countries, 36 countries in the world import more than 50% of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. And these are countries like Lebanon, these are countries like Egypt, these are countries like Yemen, Somalia. So it's highly challenging that you can imagine that there was a conflict in this country, there's sanctions on Belarus, sanctions on Russia, but it's knocked millions of people into poverty. Now, this, of course, this shortage, this dependence, has created an inordinate rise in prices. Now, when we talk about commodities like maize and wheat, we are talking about not just grain that we eat, but grain that animals eat, and also grain that goes into biofuel. So this also very much started to make us think, well, are we putting our land into the right kind of crop? Because there were people that were struggling and suffering because we were in a situation that there was less and less availability of these commodities. Now, one thing we did with the Secretary General, and I wouldn't give myself the credit for working with the Secretary General, but we did help with this, was that everybody will have seen that ships are now sailing from Odessa. Now, this was an agreement that we signed in August in Istanbul, and we are now seeing about 2 to 3 million metric tons of grain coming out of Odessa. So that immediately sees then that hike that we saw middle of February going into March has now very much eased. So that is the issue with maize. Now, one thing that I think maize and wheat, but the other thing that's so linked is, of course, the fertilizer price. Now, fertilizers have become an integral part of our food system. Of course, since the 50s, the Industrial Revolution. But we've got to understand also that globalization has meant that there are certain countries that produce more and export more, and particularly when it comes to things like phosphorus. But Russia, China, Canada, USA, Belarus, these are all massively important sources of fertilizer. And interestingly, the cost of fertilizer is linked to natural gas. And natural gas is one of the major exports of Russia. So this is a very important moment for us in the food system. Now, to compound all this, and I promise I will get to some positive messages, but I just want to give you the situation that I feel that we are in, and hopefully we can touch on, and then the rest of the session can touch on how the role that the dairy sector can have in really bridging the gap of the problems we have. Now, I tried this morning after our dancing to try to find some data around the extreme weather conditions that we've had this year. Now, I didn't get a slide, I don't think it's important, but we all can see that Northern Europe, massively dry. We are seeing record heat in India. We are seeing record flooding in Pakistan, Australia, I think I'm correct to say in the southeast of the US we have flooding, in the southwest we have record drought. We have droughts in China. I mean, climate change is here. It's really here. And it's going to become more and more of a challenge year on year on year. So I want us to take this as not as a kind of, you know, the house is burning, let's all run away, but think, look, the house is burning, but we have the tools. I firmly believe that we have the tools to try and address this. So not only can we say that the food system is impacted by climate change, but we can also see that the food system impacts climate and the environment. And these are just a few of them. And you can see that, look, there are this funny little matrix, and there are three things. There's climate, nature, and there's chemicals and pollution. And we're doing that because UNEP identified 2 or 3 years ago, and those of you that follow these things will know, that UNEP's whole focus now is on the triple planetary crisis, which is nature loss, climate change, pollution. So I just put a few things down. I'd be very happy to share this with you later, just to give you a bit of an idea about why UNEP cares about food and agriculture, food systems and agriculture. So maybe you can take the slides off now. Now, to combat all this, as Brian said, I was seconded to the Secretary General's Food Systems Summit 2.5 years ago. And while the Food Systems Summit in many ways was a bit of a talking shop, maybe it was good, maybe it wasn't, I'm not sure. Maybe people think like that. Personally, I thought it was fantastic. Why? Because it created an understanding of systems at the policy level. 140 countries committed to food systems transformation pathways. This is huge. This is something that I personally have been trying to do for years. And this was done in one effort to get all these countries specifically working on food systems in a joined up way. So we've got the positive bit of political will at the country level, but we have these incredible geopolitical issues that are forcing us into various directions. And then, of course, we have the big issue, which is climate change and biodiversity loss. So that comes to my conclusion. Okay, so what do we do about it, right? So we've heard quite a lot in the last couple of days around, okay, we've got to reduce the footprint of dairy. We've got to increase energy efficiency. We've got to reduce the water footprint. We've got to very much focus and understand and recognize the ecosystem services that come from dairy. I think that's really strong, that's fantastic. But I think what I haven't heard is this issue of resilience. Now, while I think it's very important that we talk, it's critical that we talk about greenhouse gases, what I'm missing actually is how we bring in the issue of nature, the issue of soil. Biodiversity is, I believe, the key element that is going to build resilience in the dairy sector and, of course, in the agriculture sector going forward. Now, this means bringing in what we're doing on the greenhouse gas work, but it also means developing a more holistic approach to how we understand environment sustainability. So, I think we've started a dialogue with the dairy sector. I believe the dairy sector can be the connective tissue between very much looking at greenhouse gases, but also trying to bring, for example, resilience and sustainability into, if you like, non-specific dairy forms of agriculture, if that makes sense. So how can we bring animals back on the land where they've been taken off the land? How can we bring nutrients that, of course, animals bring back on to the land? And to go back to why we are here, this is the only way that we're going to ensure sustainable nutrition and livelihoods to the millions and millions of smallholder dairy farmers that we have in this world, especially in this country. So I think I started negative. I think I've gone to positive. I hope I have, because I believe that our future is in our hands. But we have to be aware of the influences and the pressures that we, within the sector, food systems that we are facing. And with that, I thank you very much. And I leave you, Chair, to take us to the next session. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, James, and I believe you did get back to the positive where you're saying, recognising that dairy can be that connective tissue to bring all the different factors in sustainability together, which is what we have in the Dairy Sustainability Framework, the 3 pillars, the 11 criteria across the board. Our next presentation is from Dr. Pierre Gerber. Pierre is with the World Bank, will be well known to many of you, and I'm hoping there he is. He's on the screen now, which is great. It is a virtual presentation. Pierre possesses 20 years of experience in analysing trends in global livestock systems and their interactions with the environment. He leads activities aiming at mainstreaming climate and environmental considerations within the global portfolio of livestock operations at the World Bank Group. Pierre is appointed Special Professor at Wageningen University, which is in the Netherlands, and we welcome him here today. But before I let you speak, Pierre, I think I want to recognise Pierre's work, and that many of you will know the research Livestock's Long Shadow. Many of you will have an uncomfortable feeling about that project, but that project that FAO did when Pierre was there was the kickstart dairy had to start looking at sustainability, understanding sustainability and the role that dairy plays in a sustainable food system. So at the time it might have been uncomfortable reading, but actually we thank Pierre for that work and the team he worked with to try and help us get on our journey of many years ago. Pierre, over to you.
I don't see the room anymore, but if you don't, please let me know. Yeah, no, thank you, Brian, for reminding us this exercise. Long time ago, I think the long shadow was 2006. But since then, definitely, since we worked on this warning call, I think most of the effort has been placed on finding solutions, right? And there was the livestock tackling climate change with livestock reports in 2013, the creation of LEAP as an initiative to work on metrics of sustainability, the livestock global agenda, which was also bringing stakeholders together to work on solutions, and more recently, as I joined the World Bank, contributing to other initiatives which are really hands-on, working on investment in the sector to help the sector go on a sustainable path. So it's been quite a journey with multiple institutions and collaboration, but really I want to say that there was the warning call, but since then I think that all the effort has been to try and help finding solutions. And what I'm going to talk about today is the particular topic of climate finance, starting with these 3 numbers. And my presentation is pretty much on the livestock sector, because we don't really single out dairy too much in our investments, but when possible, I will highlight elements for the dairy sector. So those 3 figures, we know them, the large contribution the sector makes, the important reduction potential we have in terms of GHG emissions, but in contrast to that, the extremely tiny amount of climate finance that is really reaching the sector today. And that's where we started and tried to understand what was happening. So This is a slide which is pretty old. This, I think, comes from a collaboration between the GRA really and the dairy sector, IDF, or the Global Dairy Platform. Sorry, I'm not sure anymore. But it shows that we have a number of technical solutions ready for mitigation in the sector. They tackle the whole value chain basically, from upstream feed production to downstream processing and so on. And they are at various ranges of readiness for implementation, from things that are still in the lab to things that are really ready, best practices, and very importantly, often financially viable, not only economically viable at the level of society, but even financially viable at the level of the business. So that's very important, especially if we start thinking about climate finance, right? Because climate finance would finance viable solutions, right? So that's very important to notice, and I know that speakers after me will be much more detailed on that and have much more comprehensive reviews of the elections. So the question is, how do we incentivize, right? How do we, through finance, make sure that what is at the discovery stage receive enough attention and research is resourced enough to work on those? And how do we make sure that pilot studies are happening, that best practices are adopted at scale, so we really see a change in the sector? And climate finance is this term that is kind of brought up, and we think, okay, that there's a lot of hope there. It is really a term that encapsulates a whole range of things, really. From here you see on this figure, from the left-hand side, where you have private, essentially, resources directed to improving the climate performance of the systems. You can think about corporations that have their own company strategies in terms of sustainability, in terms of PR, and I will invest in that direction. You can think on the right-hand side, a completely public investments from governments that have taken, commitments in the context of the UNFCCC, negotiation through their NDC, and now are mainstreaming the emission reduction through the various sectors, including agriculture, through specific investments, so that's completely public. You have their official development assistance, ODA, that is also coming in, supporting investment in specific areas. And in the middle, you have carbon markets, right? And these carbon markets can be either originating in the private sector if they are voluntary, they can be originating more in the public sector if they are mandatory. And they are another way to transfer the resources to those who are really taking action on the ground. Then you have a multitude of actors and flows. I don't go into too many details. I'll give the reference to the report where we have published this figure. You can see more. But I think what is important to notice is that you have essentially two groups of climate finance here. One that is directed to the inputs, so that finances activities, investments that should lead to emission reduction, and the other type that is financing results-based payment, right? And those are very, very different. So you find mostly around carbon markets the results-based payments. So that's, you have to demonstrate, or the stakeholder has to demonstrate emission reductions to receive a payment. Whereas on the public hand side, we found more input-oriented climate finance, where we finance certain activities in terms of research, extension work, for example, that will eventually result in the adoption of practices that will themselves lead to the reduction of emissions. So that is more activity-based payment, if you want, right? What has been on our way, and that was an important part of this work to understand, going back to those three numbers, great mitigation potential, a lot of options are actually bankable, but very little flow is coming from the finance world to the livestock world to support mitigation and adaptation. Why? So here on this graph you see three broad families of obstacles in that regard. The right corner, the green boxes, relates to obstacles that are actually common to investment in general in agriculture, investment in general in smallholder production units, right? That will relate to the smallholder dairy producers, but also to the beef value chain, for example. So it's the high cost of servicing smallholder because the transaction costs are high because it's a very fragmented clientele, if you want, for the banks. The second is the high perceived risk of investing, and what James mentioned about climate change, about shocks that are happening, economic shocks that are happening, will not lower that risk, definitely. And the third one is the weak or disconnected price signal along the value chain, making that investment at some level of the value chain will not necessarily trigger gains in the other segments, and that is increasing. I mean, that is contributing to the risk that we described above. The next kind of pool of constraint is here displayed in orange, and it essentially relates to our still limited understanding or capacity to measure accurately emission reductions from certain activities or change in practices, adoption of technology, right? We have equations, but we know those equations are based on actually limited number of observations. So there is a lot of uncertainty there. And if we want to reduce this uncertainty, cost of getting the estimates of emission reduction immediately go high. And they go high because we need a lot of sampling, we need a lot of observations, we need a lot of direct measurements, etc. And so to enter a certain family of carbon markets, that is definitely a constraint for the sector, because the cost of generating emission reductions, so the cost of demonstrating that emission has been reduced is high. And then the last block in light blue here relates really to more the image of the sector and how the sector has been fairly slow but it's definitely changing, and here the dairy is as often is ahead of the curve in terms of the various subsectors in livestock. But so the image of the sector is still one that is a sector that is highly controversial, not only for greenhouse gas emissions, but other dimensions of sustainability and equity. And the sector has been, as I said, a little, especially some part of the sector have been a bit slow in really readjusting the narrative and also going towards a direction where there was a recognition of some issues and a readiness to address them. So the climate financiers who are looking across the board from energy to transport to buildings, etc., find in other sectors opportunities in terms of image, in terms of ease to operate that are more attractive than the agriculture and the livestock sector. But what we have to do is work on those obstacles and see where we have options to still put in place some financing flows that will support the sector in this transition. Important thing to note here is that when we work on that, we should not forget that we have multiple means, and it's very important whether you talk about emission reduction through efficiency gains or whether you talk about removal through carbon sequestration. There are a number of wins that are accompanying the gains in emission reduction, right? So you talk about product quality, you talk about productivity, you talk about food safety, you talk about biodiversity conservation, water systems, and it is very important also for those investing in climate that those elements that are coupled with the emission reduction are well captured in the project design. Climate finance, if looking for really, the cheapest way to generate emission reduction, will not go to agriculture. Energy, transport will always be cheaper. We'll always get more emission reduction per dollar invested. But our gain, our comparative advantage in agriculture is really a lot in those multiple ways. So it is very important that when we think about climate finance opportunities in the sector, we look at those multiple wins and we bring them in the picture, and it adds values, if you want, to the emission reductions as we're generating. Then we have, based on on this diagnostic of the situation, discussing with the stakeholders in the sector, discussing with climate finance, we have identified 6 broad opportunities for climate finance in the livestock sector. I'm not going to discuss them all here. Again, I'll give you the reference to the report where you can get a view. I'll discuss a couple, but it would be just too long for me to go through those. The one I'd like to talk about a little bit is conditional guidelines for mitigation action. I think it's really relevant to the livestock sector. We have, and to the dairy story in particular, we have worked on that in Kenya. The discussions are still ongoing, and I hope it really will materialize there. The logic here is that there are mitigation conditions. So loans are provided to invest in practices and technologies that will generate mitigation, right? And this is quantified. And in compensation for these mitigation conditions, the loan is made sweeter, right? The deal is made sweeter for the borrower. And that could be related to the collaterals, that could be related to providing additional technical assistance for the adoption of the practices and technology, that can be related to a grace period on the loan, that can be related to the length of the repayment period. There are many ways to be doing that, right? And to do this setup, you need to have a climate finance that is providing the resources basically to sweeten the loan, right? And then a local bank that is dealing with farmers as they have dealt with farmers already, but is bringing new product to their portfolio of products for dairy farmers, and then the loan recipients. And I think there is really a potential really good mechanism to accelerate and improve access to finance for those farmers who are committed to this intervention. So that's one I wanted to mention. This is the report in which you will be able to find the whole presentation of these obstacles and opportunities and the 6 options that we have identified. I'd like to present also a tool that goes together with this report. Is a tool that we have developed with the FAO, but also the Global Livestock Agenda was involved in this preparation. It's a tool that is aimed at investment teams working on investment in the livestock sector, and provide them a very unpacked and as clear as possible menu of principles and recommendations to improve the sustainability of the investments that are designed and supervised during implementation. So take a look if you are interested, and reach out to us if you see anything there. I'm going to the last couple of slides. So first, I mean, some lessons learned as we work in that area. I think that we still have a need to build momentum and to design practical implementation solutions and mechanisms. I'm a bit sorry to say that despite the fact that we see clearer how to work on climate finance flow for the livestock sector, we still miss some, and we start to have some examples. I should not say the contrary, because we start to have some examples of investment going and programs at national level that are happening in that direction. We still, I think, need to have a broader momentum and to really be able to build the confidence somehow on the side of climate finance stakeholders that this is definitely an avenue they should consider as they invest into innovation. The importance of policy financing and private financing, and those two really need to work together, and policy financing can really support the overall framework in terms of MRB, in terms of databases, in terms of reporting in the context of national commitments, etc., that will really also enable private investment in that. Important also not to remind ourselves, right, that low and middle income countries remain dependent on livestock sector. I think this is very important. It is both a question of rural population and income, and a question of diets and food security, right? And we really must keep that in mind, and we really must think climate finance in that concept. So climate finance is not there to reduce production, but it really to work on the improvement of production in the sector. And then obviously this point on MRV, I mentioned it before, you know, we still have some nuts to crack there to be able to come to scale in investment in the sector. So one last point, I just don't want to be too long, but I think climate finance has worked mostly so far, or those working on climate finance and trying to bring climate finance to livestock sector in general are working, and we are working mostly on the production side, right? And how climate finance can be one of the mechanisms that incentivize producers to adopt more sustainable practices. And it's not the only one, you know, peer-to-peer control, society engagement, etc. also. But I think we will see now also climate finance going more on the demand side, right? And how climate finance can also be a way to incentivize consumer to shift in their diets and adopt diets that mix a number of products for an overall contraction of emissions. So that's I think I also wanted to mention. To finish on a note of really on-the-ground action, I'd like to say a word about a collaboration we are having with the Biocarbon Plan in Ethiopia. So the Biocarbon Fund is a trust fund manager of the World Bank that purchases emission reduction from jurisdiction, right? So if a jurisdiction, a state, a region, a province is able to demonstrate that overall and in absolute term they have reduced the emissions issued from that geographical area, a payment is made in the context of an ERPA, emission reduction purchase agreement. And livestock always had a difficult place in those ERPAs because livestock in many regions, and Oromia of Ethiopia in particular, grows, right? So emissions from the livestock sector are growing in those areas, and somehow it was difficult to capture any efforts that were made to curb this growth from emission from the livestock sector in a context where overall emissions have to go down, right? Because somehow you could say livestock was offsetting the progress made in other sectors. So we worked with the colleagues from the Biocarbon Fund and importantly with the donors to this trust fund to devise a method under which mitigation in the livestock sector could be also understood as emission intensity reduction, right? So it was a long process which involved data modeling and so on, but also a lot of consultation with the sector and with the donors to the Biocarbon Fund. And under certain circumstances, we were able to devise a computation method that enabled the sector to access payment even if emission intensity are reduced and not absolute emissions. So, I don't want to go into details, but they look at the fact that livestock had to be an important source of emission in the jurisdiction. The second, the livestock population has to be growing. The third, that the jurisdiction, so the local government, has to demonstrate that interventions are in place to reduce emission intensity. And the third is the need to show that even though absolute emissions are growing, they are not growing faster than a certain cap that is established on historical data, etc. So I don't go into details of it, but I think that was a really important breakthrough. And at the moment, we are collecting all the background information for livestock to, in fact, enter the next phase of the APA. So I think we are really there on a good trajectory to see payments made for emission intensity reduction in the sector in that province. So I wanted to finish with that note of optimism that things are being done, and I think that as those experiences in countries such as Ethiopia and Oromia that mix a number of systems will be very relevant to other countries and other systems. I stop here. Thank you very much. This is milk production in Uzbekistan, where I'm based at the moment. Happy to continue the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pierre. Always a pleasure listening to you. You always bring something new to the conversation and the thought processes, so we very much appreciate you presenting to us virtually today. Moving right along, because we are short of time, our next speaker is Professor Greg Thoma. Greg's going to speak to us on the footprint of milk production, identifying opportunities, improvements, LEAP and beyond. And in his biography, you'll learn what the reference to LEAP is. So, Professor Greg Thoma, you may have known him, and he was introduced earlier as from the University of Arkansas. Actually, he's made a recent transition over to be the Professor of Ag Modelling and LCA at Colorado State University. Greg served as an inaugural director for the Research and Sustainability Consortium. Many of you will know that, an organisation established by the Walmart Retail Group in the US. He's been active with Food and Agriculture Organisation of the United Nations Livestock Environmental Assessment and Performance Program and Partnership, known as LEAP. Since its inception, acting as a technical advisory group, but also the co-lead for development of the poultry, hog, swine, pig, whatever you want to call it, and large ruminant guidelines, looking at how we measure the impact of these livestock species. He also served on nutrient cycling. Sorry, I need to stop now because the Minister is arriving.
Yes, so in between us we have Shri Piyush Goyal ji, Honorable Minister of Commerce and Industry, Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution, Textiles, Government of India. So I request everyone to please welcome our Honorable Minister with a round of applause. और मैं माननीय मंत्री जी से निवेदन करूंगी कि वो मंच पर स्थान ग्रहण करें और मंच की शोभा बढ़ाएं.
So we'll just continue on. We welcome the Right Honourable Minister for joining us today. We're lucky we got two. Shows the importance of environment and sustainability. So as I was saying, Greg has done a lot of work with the LEAP partnership since its inception, looking at the guidelines for swine, poultry and large ruminants. Greg's also led numerous food and agricultural life cycle assessments, and you'll start to hear a lot more of that in this session this morning. Looking at milk, cheese, milk delivery systems, yogurt, swine, poultry, corn and beef, and recently completed the total US life cycle assessment for beef production. So more importantly, that Greg did not put in his bio for this morning is Greg has been a tremendous support for the development right from the beginning of the IDF life cycle assessment methodology. He's been integral to helping the dairy sector be visionary, be leading in this pace. So Greg, without further comment, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Brian, for that introduction, and honorable ministers, distinguished panel, and intrepid audience. For me, it's a singular honor to have been invited here to present to you some of the work that I've been doing in the field of life cycle assessment. So I'll talk today, as Brian said, about opportunities for improvement, LEAP and beyond. This is a simplified diagram of the system that James described in his first talk this morning, right? So we have sustainable nutrition, sustainable food systems that need to be developed and further built that rely on the four pillars of nutrition and health: environment, society, culture, and economics. Of course, there are challenges that are specific to each region and country. Things like trading off energy-dense foods versus highly nutritious foods, such as dairy versus sugar, right? These are things that have to be considered. There are also considerations that are cultural in nature, right? So we have to understand the way in which the sustainability characteristics of our food system mesh with the local culture so that we don't make mistakes, in essence. So how do we do this? The adage, we manage what we measure, is paramount here. And so the things that Pierre spoke about, the MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, the underpinning of mitigation options and understanding how they help us mitigate, and in fact, understanding adaptation to climate change and other pressures in the food system requires that we understand quantitatively how things connect and interact. And so the framework for doing this is known as life cycle assessment. It's governed by an ISO standard. The cartoon on the right shows the 4 main components of a life cycle assessment: goal and scope, why are we doing it, what do we want to understand, inventory, collecting all of the data, right, that describe the system. Looking at the impact, climate change, water stress, eutrophication, acidification, human health impacts, etc. And it can be used for identification of hotspots, right? So we'll see in a future slide some frankly rather obvious things, that enteric methane in feed production, manure management are hotspots in the dairy sector. And so understanding that and quantifying that allows us to understand how we can reduce those impacts or characterize the continual reduction of those impacts, because we can measure it using this system of life cycle assessment. The LEAP guidelines, and this is a summary of the several guidelines that have been published. Of course, the large ruminants is most relevant for the dairy sector. But as James talked about, and he and I have spoken a bit on the side about the need to bring animals back on the livestock, and integrating crops and livestock doesn't just mean necessarily a single livestock species. And so understanding these interactions, and the very powerful thing about the LEAP guidelines is that they are specific to the individual sectors, or for example, the biodiversity, soil nutrients. They are specific to those topics, and yet they are internally consistent across all of the documents, so that the measurement process for all of these sectors can be harmonized and aligned, and we will end up with difficulties in terms of different assumptions made for different sectors. And so it's a very powerful set of guidelines in that regard. So in LCA, we talk about a system boundary, and it extends from what we call the cradle to the grave. So all the way from extraction of coal and natural resources, natural gases, James was talking about, for the production of fertilizer, all the way through the crops, to the processing of the feed, to the animals, to the production and processing of the milk, all the way through to the consumer, and of course then the end-of-life treatment of the plastics or any of the other products that are associated with that. So it's a holistic view, and this is important because it enables us to identify trade-offs between different sectors of the supply chain, as well as trade-offs between different impact categories. As a quick example, if we put an anaerobic digester on a large dairy farm in the United States, one of the benefits is reduction in carbon emissions. Another benefit is retention of nutrients in the biosolids. A disadvantage is that with this additional nutrient retention, you have to have more land available for managing the biosolids. And so these trade-offs can be identified. A good friend of mine once said that life cycle assessment quantifies, we know these things, right? These are not mysteries. Why do we need this sort of a technology or framework for this? It's so that we can quantify it, right? We know directionally where we need to go, but the LCA is one of the ways in which we can quantify this so that we can document our progress going forward. I'll skip this slide mostly. The IDF spent the last year and a half updating the guidelines, and this is one of the important things. It's a detail in LCA, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who's interested in allocation. Sorry, Brian, at length, but I'll skip this for now. So in LCA, then the next phase is the impact assessment. So this is where we take all of the greenhouse or global warming gases and we collapse them into what we call carbon footprint. So the CO2 equivalents or the eutrophication equivalents, all of the things that maybe are causing eutrophication are combined, so that we don't have perhaps thousands of individual compounds that we have to keep track of. We just have a few categories. And ultimately on the right-hand side, we see the main areas of protection that we are, as a society and culture, is concerned about: human health and ecosystem quality and availability of natural resources. We did a study in the United States. This is now about 12 years old, I suppose, but the main message remains true. So in the box chart there, we see the fuel contribution from on-farm fuel use, enteric, methane, feed footprint, manure footprint, and then the total farm footprint. The thing that's most important about this slide is that there's a tremendous variability, even in the relatively developed and more intense production systems in the United States. There's a tremendous variation in the carbon footprint. And this tells us that even without new technologies, if we can learn what those farms at the bottom are doing and transfer that knowledge to the farms at the top of this box and whisker chart, the sector as a whole can make progress. So from this, the main things I already mentioned, feed production, enteric methane, manure management are the main drivers of climate change in most dairy systems. What we saw was that all kinds of systems, from grass-based systems to intensive concentrate-based dairy systems, they were all over the map, right? You couldn't look at the bottom of that bar chart and say, oh, these are all this is milk all produced in this particular way. What we found is that it's how the system is managed. So the way in which you operate your farm is more important let me say that more carefully. Being a good steward of the resources is more important than the specific management structure you have on the farm. So again, obviously opportunities, enteric methane, manure management, and feed. And the key thing that connects all that, of course, is the animal, and feed conversion ratio touches on all three of those. So improving feed conversion reduces the quantity of feed needed, reduces the amount of manure produced, as well as the amount of enteric methane. So turning to opportunities for improvement, I have several slides that are a bit more detailed than the slide that Pierre showed with the hashes about technologies that are available for the dairy sector to implement to improve, or to help mitigate and to move towards climate neutral or net zero dairy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of these. There's some buckets that are shown in the top yellowish color. So management and breeding. Can we breed for low methane production, for example? We really don't know whether or not. We think that the possibility there is rather low in terms of both the amount per day that can be reduced and the intensity that could be reduced per kilogram of milk produced. Using lipids as a means to reduce enteric methane has some potential, medium level potential, but we don't yet know what all of the interactions are. Over on the right-hand side, you can see some of the limitations of each of these technologies. Improving forage quality perhaps will be valuable, but we don't know all of the details and what might be trade-offs in terms of yield and milk quality, for example, in terms of the nutrition bucket. Looking at the rumen microbiome and manipulation of enteric fermentation, I'll point to the third one down. A colleague of mine, Hermes Kibrab from University of California at Davis, has done some studies showing that certain species of seaweed can reduce enteric methane by as much as 80 to 85%. So it's quite significant. The chemical compound in those algae and seaweed is a bromoform, and the health impacts on animals and on consumers of milk is not yet well known, nor do we really know what the full life cycle assessment of the production and distribution of the seaweed, right? So there's some opportunities, but of course they're going to be regionally specific, and so we have to be able to understand how these things all interact. And then you can see some other, the 3-NOP has pretty high, it's ready to come to market. I believe it's being marketed now in the United States, but it's as well controversial and not certain to be allowed everywhere. Clearly manure management, so anaerobic digestion. Brian and I hope can I mention the conversation you had last night? About the small digester? Well, I did already, sorry. So Brian had a conversation that I overheard about small-scale methane capture, right? And it is not necessarily only for big farms. In the United States, it seems to be only really financially viable for very large farms. But we need to be able to innovate and scale this down so that it can be used in smallholder situations such as we have in India and across much of the rest of the globe. Carbon stock management, of course, is going to be very important. We need to understand more fully the potential for sequestration in the dairy sector and begin to capture those benefits. And lastly, there are inputs to a farm, of course, energy, fuel, et cetera. And can we reduce those inputs? You remember from the box and whisker chart that fuel was pretty low on the list of contributing factors, and so there's not a whole lot of opportunity, but it's not zero. And so if these things are technically and economically feasible, they should also be investigated. I'm going to completely skip this. So concluding, LCA is an effective tool, although it's not yet robust enough to capture all of the things that we care about. It doesn't do a very good job of capturing biodiversity effects, for example. It doesn't also do a very good job of capturing the positive aspects, right? LCA tends to ask the question, how can we be less bad about what we're doing? And so that's a shift that we need to begin making in away from what can I do that's less bad and begin thinking about what can I do that's more good. We have a lot of mitigation options, as you saw from the slide and from Pierre's presentation. And the last point I'll make is that net zero and climate neutrality, we can make a lot of progress in the dairy sector, but I think it will be non-trivial to really achieve a fully zero emissions or climate neutral dairy sector. We'll need development and implementation of new technologies and management practices to get there all the way. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Greg. And Greg's reference to allocation for me is professor in this area. He's referring to my ignorance and how long it took me to understand the concept of allocation. And Greg has been very patient with us as a dairy sector as we ask so many questions about how we can apply the science appropriately as a responsible industry to make sure we're reporting appropriately our emissions and understanding that. And importantly, as Greg just said, how we can improve that, because that's what we're all striving to do. Now, next on the agenda, we've got a bit of an exciting piece of news. The IDF runs action teams to develop new knowledge, materials for the dairy sector globally. Over the last year, we've been working with an action team in the IDF on life cycle assessment. And I won't steal their thunder, but we've got our president, Pierre Cristiano, and also one of the action team members here in the room, and hopefully we have one of the action team, sorry, not action team members, chair, sorry Anna, and another action team chair, Sanne Dekker, on the line, hopefully from the Netherlands, who've been working on the update to the life cycle assessment methodology that was first launched in 2010. As I said, we have not been working on this since last year. We've been working on this work since 2010. So this is the second update of the IDF methodology. Now, Pierre Cristiano, I hope you don't mind. I was not given a bio for you, so I've made one up. Okay? So, President of International Dairy Federation, a farmer, a dairy processor. He's a board member of the IDF Global Dairy Platform, and importantly, I would say this would deny the Dairy Sustainability Framework. The list goes on, but my good friend, can I invite you to the stage now to help us launch the latest update of the IDF methodology. Following that, Anna will come in and talk about what's new in the IDF methodology, and if I can just give Anna's profile, and then we can go straight into Anna's presentation. Please come here, Pierre Cristiano, it's fine. Dr. Fleischau has a background in sustainable food production, consumption, which he worked with almost 20 years. with specific focus on life cycle assessment in Arla Foods. Her focus is on climate, environmental impact of dairy, and she is also co-leading this action team that I just described. Importantly, with the co-leads of Sana, who's here on the screen, and Anna, they're from dairy cooperatives. They're driving this process because if we're going to implement this knowledge, we need these guys to help us implement at the grassroots level, and the cooperative movement's helping us do that. Pierre Cristiano, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you for being here after the gala dinner yesterday. So I'm really pleased to be with you today at the launch of the IDF methodology for assessing the carbon footprint impact of the dairy sector. IDF, like you know, is very engaged in the debate on how to feed the world with healthy and sustainable diets. The global dairy sector takes climate change really seriously. Today is a very special day for everyone and for me because we are launching a key publication for our sector. This methodology, the carbon footprint guidance, was first published in 2010 and already in 2015 it had a first revision. This new and improved version provides even greater clarity to the science-based assessment of carbon footprint through the dairy value chain. With my interest and knowledge in environmental issues, I fully appreciate the hard work and collaborative effort required to bring the Federation's methodology to where it is now. It took persistence, commitment, and an immense amount of expertise from over 50 experts, each contributing in a unique and positive way. Congratulations to both the action team leaders, Anna Fliegio and Sanne Decker, who could not be here today in bringing it all together so beautifully and in such a short time. Thank you also to Brian for the contribution to the action team. I would like to thank the experts who developed this work and thank them for their commitment to the work of the International Dairy Federation. Thank you.
So before starting my presentation here today, I just wanted to build on what Per Cristiano said. I have now for the last 1.5 years had the pleasure to work with Sanne Decker, who's a colleague and really dear friend as well. And I know I also speak for her when I say that we feel very privileged to be leading this action team for this time. And this work could definitely not been done without them. And we have some of them here in the room today. So we have Paula from Danone, we have Greg from Colorado State University, and also Bhupendra from NDDB. So a big thank you to all of them, also them that are here today. And it's been, and I know especially Bhupendra has really put another perspective because this is a global standard for the global dairy industry. And to have an understanding how also the Indian dairy sector has been really valuable. So I'm also really grateful to have the opportunity to be here today and also have a better understanding for the Indian dairy industry. So thanks a lot for that. And as said before, this work started already back in 2009. And I think it's really a good example how the dairy industry is collaborating. And so I would also like to take the opportunity to also thank GDP for their contribution to this project. So first I would like to go back a little bit and talk about LCA and development the last couple of decades. So the first LCA, the first life cycle assessment was done or published in year 2000. So it's more than 20 years now. And to date, more than 4,800 LCA or carbon footprint studies of dairy has been published, which is quite a huge number. And this report was also mentioned earlier today, Livestock's Long Shadow, which was published in 2006. And I really think that there, the focus on the livestock sector's contribution to global warming started. And then also FAO launched this other guideline on greenhouse gas emissions from the dairy sector, and also stating that the dairy sector stands for 4%, including also the beef, or 2.7 if you only look at the dairy products. And then there's also this other guide that was done with FAO and GDP and Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, looking at how has the greenhouse gas emission developed over time. So between 2005 and 2015, the total milk production has increased with 30%, and total greenhouse gas emissions had increased with 18%, which actually mean that on a global scale, the dairy production is more efficient in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So during this 10-year period, the greenhouse gas emissions per kilo milk was reduced with 11%. So this is just a little bit that's been going on within dairy when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And if we then go more into the methodology and what's been doing there, so the first you see here is the IDF guide that was launched back in 2010. So this was the first time where the dairy sector went together and said, this is how we want to calculate the carbon footprint, or this is how we think it should be calculated. So it was a lot of scientific experts contributing to this guide that was published in 2010. And it was then again updated and revised in 2015. Then we also have some other guides, the one that Greg already presented here, that was launched in 2016, so that is the LEAP guideline on large ruminants. And we also have a European guide from the European Commission, the PEF, the Product Environmental Footprint Category Rule, that was done by EDA, European Dairy Association. So there are a lot of standards on how you shall calculate the carbon footprint or environmental impact of dairy. Though, luckily, all these guides are more or less aligned, which makes life a little bit more easy. And today, we are launching the new guide, and we actually changed the name of this, so instead it's the IDF standard to carbon footprint calculations for the dairy sector. And yeah, it's me and Sanne who is chairing this or co-chairing this action team. We have Brian Lindsay, who's been the project manager from GDP, and then of course also IDF and Maria Sanchez Marinar. And in total, we are more than 50 LCA and dairy experts covering 7 nationalities, so this team has been growing. So this is the guide on how you should quantify, how you should calculate contribution to global warming for dairy products specifically. And there has really been a growing interest in this during the years. So it feels really, really good to be standing here today and say that we now have a new updated version of this guideline. So the purpose with this guide. The aim of this guide is to support the dairy industry in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions to reduce its potential impact on global climate change. And using this methodology, it's about reporting. It could be on corporate level or on product level. And it covers the full life cycle from cradle to grave, if you would like that. So both farming, manufacturing operations, but also the rest of the value chain. So of course it depends on the scope, what you're interested to analyze, but it does cover now the full value chain. And you can also then monitor the greenhouse gas emissions to demonstrate progress over time. How have the emission evolved on a product level or on a corporate level? LCA is also a very good tool to identify hotspots, to be able to focus on mitigation actions. Where in the value chain should you reduce your emissions? What is more cost efficient? and also to see what are the impact of different greenhouse gas mitigation options. And of course, it's really important to be able to communicate about this, and that is also one of the purposes with this guide, to be able to communicate with both customers and consumers in a scientifically correct way. So to have a robust methodology. And then, of course, there is a lot of comparison of different products toward each other. For example, if you compare dairy products with other food products, then it's also really important to consider what is the purpose or the scope or the aim of the study you are doing. And here we come back to what Greg was mentioning with the functional unit, and that is really critical when you do a life cycle assessment, is to understand what is the function of, for example, the product you're looking into. If your study would be that you want to see how should you, if you compare different products to see what is the most environmentally friendly way to just put out thirst, like not being thirsty, what should you then drink? Then the answer would probably be water. That would be the best drink to put out the thirst. If it would be you want to have the coffee white, well, then maybe it could be some plant-based beverage. That would be the best environmental option. But if the focus is to provide a certain amount of nutrition, then dairy stands in a really, really good place. So this with the functional units is really critical when looking into how you should define the function unit. And we have seen this picture already, or a slight other version of it. So this is the 4 life cycle stages when you do, or 4 stages when you do a life cycle assessment. So the first is the goal of the study, which I just said, to understand what is the function of the study, etc., what is the purpose. Then it's also about to define the scope. For example, should it be a cradle to gate, to factory gate, or do you want to include the whole value chain, for example, cradle to grave? Then we have the data collection or the inventory analysis, which is the most resource-intense stage typically. This is where you collect all the data to be able to do your calculations. Then we have the impact assessment, and that's when you convert your greenhouse gases into one common unit to be able to assess that. And finally, we have the interpretation, and that is to understand the results and also preferably to do some kind of sensitivity analysis to be able to understand how have your assumptions or how is the data affecting if you would change something in your system, how robust is your result. And then, of course, finally, it's really important to report your result transparently as well. So just to explain this a little bit more, I will just take an example, a very, very quick example on how to calculate the carbon footprint. So first, as I said, to define the functional unit. Here, it's not a comparative LCA, so it's just 1 kilo of milk. And then you need to draw the value chain. So you start at farm level with all the inputs coming there. You have some byproducts, that could be meat, for example. You have some transportation. You have the dairy manufacturing site, where the byproduct could be cream, if you are looking into the skim milk. And then you have the distribution as well. And then you need to collect data for all these different life cycle stages. All the feed that is going in, how was that produced, how much methane from the cows, how much fertilizer has been purchased, how was that produced, etc., etc. So you collect all this data and you calculate the emissions. And then you will get a certain amount of emission of methane, about nitrous oxide emissions, and CO2. And when it comes to the farm level, then it's both methane and nitrous oxide. For the rest of the value chain, it's mainly about fossil CO2. And then in order to aggregate these gases, you need to convert them into one common unit. It's the same as you do with money. If you want to convert everything into US dollars, for example, then you need a conversion factor for the euros or for the kroners or for the pounds, etc., into this one common unit. When you talk about carbon footprint, this unit is CO2 equivalents. So then you multiply methane with 27 and nitrous oxide with 273, etc. And then you can aggregate everything and you can get some kind of result like this. And you can see what is then the carbon footprint of your milk for the whole life cycle. And this is an example for a farm in Northern Europe. And then methane stands for around half. So that is methane emissions from enteric fermentation and manure. You have nitrous oxide emission, maybe around for a third or so. And then you have the CO2 standing for the rest. And you see here that the farm really stands for the largest share, and the other stages of the life cycle stands for less of the impact. So what is then included at the farm level? So we have the farm, of course, itself, but then you have a lot of inputs to it as well. So you have fertilizer production, where you both have nitrous oxide and CO2 emissions. You have all the feed production that can come from all around the world. It could be soy in South America and grain from Ukraine, etc. Where you both have NTO and CO2 emissions. And also, of course, the transportation. And then you also have inputs of fuel and electricity. And then you also have all the other activities going on the farm. So that is methane from enteric fermentation. So that is when the cow is digesting the feed and burping methane. You have N2 and CO2 from the manure handling. You also have emissions from field operation, from the diesel combustion, and so on. Then there can also, of course, be some carbon sequestration, which is illustrated here by the arrow going down. And then you have these products leaving the farm. So you have, of course, the milk, you have the meat, and in some cases you can also have manure. And that I really learned here in India, that this is also really an important byproduct. And this is an overview to what different standards and guidelines have we been looking at when we have been developing this guideline, because there is a lot out there. So you have some overall standards. We have the ISO, that is really the fundamental, like the Bible for everyone doing an LCA. So ISO 14040, 44, and then a specific one also for calculating carbon footprint specifically. Then we have the greenhouse gas protocol, which is very much for corporate reporting. We have the, which I mentioned before, the EU product environmental footprint, which has been an ongoing project for many years now. And then also in UK, they have a PAS 2050 that has got quite a lot of attention when it was developed back in 2008-9 or so. And then we have some dairy specific, as I said, of course, the IDF. We also have the dairy PEF. We also have the FAO LEAP for large ruminants that Greg was presenting. And also another EPD for dairy, which is also a global standard developed in Sweden. Then we have some supplementary guides as well. So for example, IPCC is really important both for calculating emissions, so they provide emission factors for nitrous oxide emissions, for example, but they also give these characterization factors on how you should convert methane nitrous oxide into CO2 equivalents. And then we also have on carbon removals, for example, greenhouse gas protocol is developing something on this, and also the CSEC guide that was launched in this Tuesday. So just to summarize the IDF carbon footprint guideline, it uses attribution LCA approach opposed to consequential. I will not go into that at all, but happy to explain if anyone will be interested. And as I said before, luckily, all the carbon footprint guides, as I've been showing on the previous slide, are more or less aligned. This update of the IDF guide gives guidance for the full value chain. And it also actually includes a proposal on how you can include nutritional value in your functional unit. And it also includes reference to calculate other environmental impact categories besides climate. And these are some new things compared with the previous version of the IDF guide. And it feels, as I said, really nice or really good that this guide is now launched, because now we will have time to focus on the next step. So this action team is for sure not standing still just because we launched this guide. We have a lot of things that we would like to do. For example, we have also in the IDF website dedicated a site there to be able to provide a more dynamic updates of the guide, because it could come things. Maybe IPCC comes with some new factors should be used or whatever. Then instead of doing the whole process, we can just update or put the information on this web page. We are also working towards a verification, so carbon footprint tools could be able to be verified against the IDF methodology. And then we have also been talking about developing carbon footprint tool. All this with the nutritional values, really, really important. That is something we also will work more with and engaging with nutritional team. Manure allocation is something we discussed a lot in the action team, and I think that discussion will also go on. And of course, not least, to look further into mitigation options, because the whole purpose of this, guys, like the overall aim is to reduce and mitigate climate change. So that's also something we will look into. And then, of course, engage with relevant groups and stakeholders. For example, EU PEF, the SAI and the SDP, the GDP, the DSF, Pathways to Direct Net Zero, FAO, GRA, etc., etc. So again, I just would like to say a big thank you to the whole action team, and we'll continue the journey. And you see here all the action team members. And if you're interested to join this action team, please contact Sun or me or Maria, and we would be happy to have you on board.
Thank you, Anna. And I think what you're seeing through many of the presentations today is how the dairy sector tries to align with other initiatives. We're not trying to be different, but we're also collaborating, and I think that's absolutely key in the work we do. We're just going to have a slight change to the agenda now. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you the Right Honourable Minister of Commerce and Industry, Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution and Textile for the Government of India, Right Honourable Mr. Shri Pierre Gerber.
Thank you very much, my good friend and colleague, Shri Purushottam Rupalaji, all the distinguished guests and senior leaders of the dairy sector who have come to attend the IDF World Dairy Summit, being held after nearly 5 decades in Delhi, and all the distinguished participants of this very important engagement. A very good morning to all of you. I cannot claim much knowledge about this sector, but a little bit of what I was able to hear from the professor and from you, madam, was quite interesting, intriguing in parts, but certainly very educative. I took the opportunity of studying some of the notes that were presented to me and realized that across the world, we are now becoming more and more conscious of our responsibilities towards the environment, towards the consumer in terms of quality, in terms of higher nutritional value, and towards the farmers or the dairy producers in terms of their livelihood. And I must compliment all of you for the sustained efforts made across the world and in India, particularly by reputed organizations like the NDDB. We have with us here Mr. Sondi from Amul and other senior leaders, all of whom have been doing human service, really doing outstanding work in supporting millions of our women, millions of our farmers, in providing supplementary income to their livelihood, providing nutrition for their children. Very often in the course of our negotiations or discussions at international forums about free trade, about greater engagement on international trade, the dairy sector also does come up. We are very conscious that we would like to see more and more engagement amongst nations, and being the world's largest producer of dairy, with nearly 1/4 of the world's production coming from India, and potentially, given the kind of initiatives that the government has taken, that our cooperative sector is taking, that our farmers are taking, I do believe our global share of production over the years will see a significant rise, which is good both for our small and marginal farmers, who are largely the persons who hold the nearly 300 million bovine stock that we have in India, for whom it's supplementary income, which is very valuable. It also provides nutrition for their children. I'm given to understand 1/3 of our production is used by the small farmer himself or herself for their family consumption. And in this context, when we talk of greater degree of quality standards, when we talk of sustainability, India very much wants to engage with the world. India very much wants to be a part of this global effort to bring down the impact of farming or dairy on global emissions. And therefore an engagement such as this, and I was seeing the program and the very vast array of subjects you have covered, is very relevant for the stage at which we are in India today. I'm sure when the Honorable Prime Minister was here, or when the Honorable Home Minister was here, they must have mentioned about India's commencement of its Amrit Kal, the next 25 years, as we move from 75 years of independence to 100 years of independence. And our collective commitment as a nation to become a developed country, a country that takes prosperity to 1.3 billion people across the length and breadth of the country. And out of that 1.3 billion people, we have nearly 70 million families, particularly amongst the very small and marginal farmers, some having 2 acres, 3 acres of farmland, 2 or 3 cattle producing milk. I'm sure all the distinguished participants from across the world will appreciate that what we are discussing is literally like chalk and cheese. They are 2 poles apart. We are looking at a set of dairy farmers numbering in a few thousand in maybe the oceanic countries, Australia, New Zealand, most of the European countries, also in America. I don't think America would have even 100,000 farmers who are producing dairy. And the production is not small. Probably 10% of the world production coming from the United States. And 100,000 or less than that persons who are actually holding that cattle, holding the stock, large farms, large cattle farms. And a lot of what I was seeing on your presentation, madam, on your professor, clearly is focused towards that ecosystem. And we very much welcome that, and I think it's appreciable, the wonderful work that the IDF is doing across the world. What the scientists are doing, what the experts are studying and doing research on. But I do think we'll have to look at contemporary or relevant solutions for small farms, for small holdings, and come up with solutions which make our farming more sustainable, more eco-friendly, hopefully more profitable. help them improve productivity, help them improve quality, help them recycle or reprocess the manure or the cow dung or any of the other associated global gas emissions sources. And I would urge the IDF to have a dedicated team, possibly even stationed in India for a couple of years, which does this kind of research literally at the farm level, at the local levels, with different climatic conditions across the country, and come up with solutions which will help us align ourselves with global standards and global emission norms. I can assure you, India wants to be a part of the solution and not the problem. I can assure you that our farmers in India are very conscious of their responsibility to nature and to the environment. And not today, and not because in the last 2 or 3 decades, the world has woken up to this reality. In fact, on a lighter note, when my good friend, and I can call him my good friend because we have had several engagements and we really understand each other, Vice President Al Gore, with whom I've had a series of engagements on climate change and sustainability. When he came out with the inconvenient truth, maybe nearly 18 or 20 years ago, our Prime Minister, who was then the Chief Minister of the state of Gujarat, which is one of the most progressive states in the country, and from where our Honorable Minister, Mr. Rupala, comes, he came out with his own response to the inconvenient truth, which was convenient action. And I think that's what all of us here are assembled for. That's what all of you are working towards. What will be the way forward? How are we going to find relevant and applicable solutions which work in different environments, different ecosystems? And farming in India, traditionally, and I don't even talk of decades, I'm not even talking of centuries, I'm talking of thousands of years. Farmers in India intrinsically, by nature, by their very philosophical thinking, believe in sustainability. India is one country where animals are looked upon as God, where the trees, where rivers, all of them are revered because of their contribution to our lives. And in that context, the little bit of produce that our cattle gives to sustain livelihoods, nutritional support for our farmers, come with great commitment to see how that will have least impact on the environment. Most of our farmers are very conscious that the cow dung has huge potential as manure, and a lot of it goes back into the soil, which helps us reduce our fertilizer or pesticide requirements. And therefore, in a way, I don't know if it ever gets captured as our contribution to climate change efforts of mitigation, but all of that is a serious contribution also to reduce the pesticide and fertilizer consumption. Biogas and various ways to use that cow dung through digesters or whatever is the equipment used. I'm sorry, I'm not a technical person. I'm a poor little chartered accountant and law graduate. I don't understand too much of farming. I don't even recall when I would have last had the opportunity to go and actually visit a dairy. I think the last time I visited it was in Vrindavan, where Sadhvi Ritambra ji is running a very good program and protecting stock which does not produce milk anymore, but helping to save our cattle. And I remember my wife had had donated a biogas making plant there. So that's my little bit of last interaction on this subject. But I'm trying to recall from all the various experiences that truly Indian farmers are very conscious that if they mess up with the environment, it's going to come back to us. It's going to come and haunt us. And in that respect, over the years, whether it's in fishing, whether it's in farming, whether it's in dairy, we have tried to keep our contribution to global house emissions at the very least. And therefore, a country supporting nearly 17% of the world population has contributed barely 3% to all that gas which is up there and hurting the world. In this situation, I think more relevant solutions, more cost-effective solutions given to the farmers will be adopted very readily by the farmers, will be adopted very readily by our dairy which produces the milk products. But at the same time, we do very strongly believe that the developed world has totally failed in meeting its commitments to support the developing countries and the emerging markets or less developed countries through their contributions of technology, through their contributions of low cost, long tenor, government supported climate finance. And that's a very natural outcome that comes out of the polluter pays principle. And therefore I would urge the IDF to also consider a global effort that those who are contributing to this problem or who have been responsible for this problem over the years actually put on the table relevant technology and cash, if I may say so, to mitigate the problem in the less developed countries. And that will include many countries in Africa, it will include many countries in Asia, many of whom who have the commitment but don't necessarily have the technology and resources. This was a commitment made by the developed world maybe 10 or 12 years ago. It was reiterated in Paris at the COP21 when India played a leading role to get the whole world aligned with the world's commitments towards climate change. But sadly, 7 years after Paris, all we hear is slogans, all we hear is, with due respects to all of you, very good presentations, but not action. And I would urge that the message that the IDF 2022 should take to the world should include this message of a commitment of India and farmers in India. And in a way I speak for all the less developed countries and developing countries. The message has to go that we mean business when it comes to addressing this challenge, but it will be good business for the rest of the world also to participate in this effort with that same spirit and contribute to this effort with the responsibility of having benefited from the fruits of dairy for so many decades and years. And you can do any relevant assessment of the contribution of Indian dairy compared to the mechanized farming and dairy across the world. I am very confident India will come out a solid winner and a much less contributor to this problem. I don't know whether IDF likes what I am saying or whether I have been invited in the first place at all with the expectation that I would not be speaking. I have some notes also. I can speak very good things. I have all the right comments. Everybody in IDF will love me if I read out what I've got with me. But I thought of using this opportunity to speak from my heart And I found most parts of the developed world very sensitive to our concerns when we speak honestly and when we speak with that understanding that I have, I think, with most trade ministers, at least across the world, that the Prime Minister has with all global leaders. I can share with you my experience with Australia, for example. I've just concluded a free trade agreement with Australia. I don't know if any of you are from Australia. You. So anyway, Ryan, I must acknowledge and thank you and all Australians. My own experience when I was working with the Australian government, and bipartisan. It's not about one government or the other. Whether it was Dan or it's Don. Dan was the earlier trade minister. Don is the current trade minister of Australia. And I must say, bipartisan. When I shared with them the agony of small farmers in India, when I shared with them the constraint and the difficulties in which our small dairy producers are working, the sensitivity which I experienced in my conversations with them, the deep understanding. I think the Ambassador Barry actually went and visited some farms also. I must share with all of you and with friends from across the world. They were so appreciative of our Indian farmers and the difficulties that Indian small dairy with 2 or 3 cattle go through, that not once did either of the two political parties there raise an issue about free trade between countries in dairy or free engagement on some of these very sensitive products. Probably for the first time for a country like New Zealand we've not done it as yet, but with Australia, for the first time, Australia would have engaged with any country. And that's the deep sensitivity that even touched my heart. And I would appeal to all the members and leadership of IDF that please hear India's voice and the sensitivity of that 30, 40 liters, Sondiji, or 50 liters that this farmer produces, gives a part of it for his children. The woman sells a part of it to our dairy. And maybe that's what helps them go to school. Maybe that's what supplements that little income that is required for their families. So lots to be said, lots to be done, but I think for today, my only message to all our esteemed panelists is, please take up this subject with greater relevance and focus also on the developing countries, also on the small farmers. Come up with solutions. I can assure you on behalf of every farmer in this country, with the confidence that the farmers will back us up fully, that we give them good sustainable solutions. They will implement it. They will make sure that the nature is protected, that climate is protected, and the world is a safer place to live in, a better place to live in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, sir, for sharing your golden words. And now, to felicitate our Minister, I request Shri Minesh Saha, Chairman of NDDB, to present a memento to Shri Piyush Goyal ji, Honorable Minister of Commerce and Industry, Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution, Textiles, Government of India. Can we have some round of applause, everyone, please? धन्यवाद करना चाहूँगी कि वो यहाँ पर आए और अपनी उपस्थिति के साथ इस सेशन को और भी ज़्यादा प्रीशियस और भी ज़्यादा महत्वपूर्ण बनाया. तो once again thank you so very much to our minister sir for making this session even more gracious with your precious presence. Thanks a lot. And I request remaining people to be seated. We'll be continuing this session. Yes, thank you so much. I request everyone to please settle down. We'll be continuing with our session.
Well, what a privilege to have that presentation, and it's great to have that challenge. And I can assure the Right Honourable Minister the dairy sector does listen. I believe we're given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We need to do a lot more listening to enable us to build the right strategies going forward. It's unfortunate the Minister won't be with us for the next session, because the next session really will demonstrate how we're looking to find solutions for all types of dairy farmers around the world, whatever geography they're operating in. And we're going to hear a presentation on a new, not so new now, initiative, a collaborative initiative by the dairy sector called Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. Now, this session has 2 presenters. In the UK where I now live, you know I'm Australian now, but the UK where I live, retailers would call this in their sales a bog-off. Buy one, get one free. I will leave you to decide which one you'd buy and which one you should get for free. Our first speaker is the IDF Director General, Ms. Caroline Imonde. She was appointed Director General of the International Dairy Federation in February 2018. A lawyer by training, has been a diplomat, has 25 years of experience in senior executive and public affairs roles in public, private and not-for-profit sectors. Caroline Imonde hails from Quebec, Canada, but is now, as you would appreciate, living in Brussels, which is where the head office of the IDF is. I'll also take the opportunity to introduce her co-speaker, with Mr. Donald Moore. Donald is the Executive Director of Global Dairy Platform, collaboration already happening here, based in Chicago, USA, and serves as Chairman of the Dairy Sustainability Framework, i.e. my boss, as leader of the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative, which you're going to hear about now, and is also a member of the United Nations Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, where all livestock species come together and share knowledge. He's also the past chairman of the International Agri-Food Network and is the private sector mechanism to the United Nations Committee on World Food Security. Before joining GDP in 2010, Donald spent 10 years with Fonterra Cooperative Group in New Zealand. I'll hand over to Caroline and then Donald. I'm assuming that's the process.
Thank you. I can guarantee there's none of us for free. Actually, it is a joint presentation. There's not 2 speakers. It's one presentation we're doing together. And just to follow up on the minister's question, I can tell you that we've got tons of actions and we look forward to do more. And this summit has been an inspiration to us all, and invite you to the last session when we'll be talking a bit about that. I think it's important to mention that the global dairy sector sustainable journey has started several years ago. And as part of that, the dairy sustainability framework has been created almost like 9 years ago with that objective of tracking, measuring, and reporting sustainability performance. As you can see, our reporting has been started already. The Pathways to Net Zero initiative that we're presenting to you today is an umbrella that's encompassing a lot of the work we've been doing. The LCA we've presented this morning, the carbon sequestration document we've actually released yesterday, all of the work of DSF in terms of reporting, and a lot of the work of our stakeholders. So this is really an umbrella that is taking into consideration the commitment of all of the stakeholders that you will see later and that are doing it in their countries. So it is really a massive initiative. As part of that journey as well, we had the work that has been mentioned a bit earlier that has been done on dairy emission. And all of that is contributing to the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. Initiative was launched actually 1 day prior to the UN Food System Summit in September 2021. And as you can see, it is a multi-stakeholder initiative, a great collaboration between all of the dairy interested organizations, including our stakeholders such as International Livestock Research Institute, the Global Research Alliance, that is a research partner, very important for this initiative, as well as the FAO and SCI platform. So it is really a multi-stakeholder initiative that we are continue to progress. It's an ongoing work and will be for many years to go. It's a movement, and really hope that if you don't see your list later on the slide, that you sign up right after this meeting, because we want you part of that journey. So I pass it on to Donald to go into more of detail on the research and activity. And as we say, we're getting very little time, so please bear with us. There's so much we could say, but we'll definitely continue the conversation afterwards. Go for your thing.
Well, thank you, Caroline, and thank you to the Honourable Minister for throwing down a challenge which we are already working on. So I want to share with you today the work that's going on within the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative, as Caroline has introduced it. As she mentioned, sustainability is not something that the dairy sector woke up 12 months ago and decided it needed to address. You saw on the slide earlier that within the dairy sustainability framework, we're already tracking and reporting on over 30% of the world's dairy production across 11 different criteria, including environmental, economic, and social outcomes. And within the environmental outcomes, we can see that the single most prioritized topic across the global dairy sector is on greenhouse gas emissions. And that led us to develop this program, Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. So what are the objectives of this program? Well, one of the things that we recognize, and I think the Honourable Minister touched on this as well, we recognize that you cannot address greenhouse gas emissions on its own. You need to think about the totality of the food system, as both James and our speaker, Pierre from World Bank, both touched on. We need to think about how a food system comes together. That means we can't tackle reductions in greenhouse gas emissions without considering any impact that that might have on issues like food and nutrition security, or indeed animal health and welfare. And we have to be careful that we don't trade one environmental outcome off against another. So when tackling greenhouse gas, we've got to be very careful that we don't create problems in water or biodiversity or other areas. This is a complex problem. And unfortunately, too many organizations think that there are simple solutions to the problems of climate change. This is a complex problem. Now, I often use the analogy of the Rubik's Cube, which I'm sure many of you in the room are clever enough to have solved. You know, the cube with 8 sides with different colors. This is like solving a Rubik's Cube for the environment. We have to make sure that all outcomes are catered for and that we don't have any unintended consequences. Now, in order to do that, we need to understand that of the 133 million dairy farms in the world, there is not one farm system. There are very many different farming systems around the world, farm ecosystems, as I think the Minister was referring to it as. And in order for us to come up with a strategy to reduce emissions from the dairy sector, we need to understand all of those different ecosystems and come up with pathways that farmers can use to address their own environmental situation. And ultimately, again, to the Minister, and it's such a pity he didn't stay to hear us, but the Minister's comments, what we really want to do is we want to see action. As our good friend from FAO, Tanawat Tenson, has said in several of his presentations, we want to demonstrate that the dairy sector is taking action, not just talking. So you've seen over the last few days some great tools, methodologies, processes that are being put in place. This program that Caroline and I are sharing with you today is about turning all that into action and commitment. There are already well over 120 major organizations from around the world who have signed on to Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, including the National Dairy Development Board of India, as well as many of the world's largest dairy companies and also many of the world's smallest dairy organizations. If you don't find your name on that list, we encourage you, as Caroline said, we encourage you to sign on and join this initiative as well. What are we doing this year? So last year at COP26, we held a major event where we shared with the world what the dairy sector was going to do on Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. This year at COP27, we're holding another event. And during that event, we'll be talking about the progress we've made since launching in at COP26. And then next year at COP28, it is our intention to take the stage and talk about the results that we're achieving as a dairy sector. So an announcement, progress this year, results next year. So this year, what we're working on, and particularly on this slide, I've got two columns here. One column is about the research work that's going on, and I'll share some of the latest research with you. The other column is about how do we execute, how do we deliver, how do we get organizations, countries committed to this program. So on the research side, what we're really doing at the moment is finalizing those system topologies. That is work that is being led by FAO in conjunction with the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. And then for each of those system topologies, we're looking at which mitigation options will deliver the best outcome, the best bang for your buck, if you like. And then looking from 2015 out to 2050, let's start by benchmarking where we're at with greenhouse gas emissions today, and then look at all of those interventions that take us out to 2050 to see what the potential for reductions across the sector are. And then building all of that into a series of pathway guides, as I mentioned before, that can be used to help farmers translate that into activity on their farm. Then on the other side of the equation, it's like, how do we turn this into action? So we're doing all this great work in research and in tools and methods. How do we turn that into action? And there are two things we need to think about. And again, I think the Minister touched on this. There is the work that's going on in what I would think of as the developed dairy world, Western Europe, North America, Oceania, those larger scale farms, many of them who are already pushing ahead with technologies, with practice change that will help to reduce emissions. But how do we help emerging dairy economies to tackle the emissions that are coming from the emerging nations? And the FAO's analysis of greenhouse gas emissions indicate that about 80% of the emissions from the dairy sector are coming in the developing dairy economies. And to Pierre Gerber from World Bank's comments before, he said there's little finance going into those sectors, into the developing dairy sectors, and indeed into the developing agricultural sector. So how can we help to bring finance, to bring tools, technologies to those markets? And I want to talk about that as well. And that really results in us building programs that will appeal to and be received by the Green Climate Fund. But before I go there, I thought I'd just share very briefly some of the latest research that we've got. Now, this chart comes from FAO. I'm sure many of you have seen it before. The x-axis along the bottom is the productivity of cows in the world. Each blue dot is a single country. And then up the y-axis is how much greenhouse gas is produced per kilogram of milk in that country. And as I mentioned before, about 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world are coming from the lower productivity, typically in more the emerging dairy economies. So we got about 80% of the challenge there. With FAO's help, we've started to settle in on these different system topologies. So we tend to think of the farming systems that are up on the left-hand side of our chart, those that are high-emitting, low-yielding as pastoral or agro-pastoral systems. And then as you move across the slide towards the right-hand side, you get into high-input, high-output systems, typically very large yields per cow with relatively low greenhouse gas emissions per cow. This is where it gets new, though. Here is an analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions for each of these different systems around the world. So you'll notice that in the pastoral and agro-pastoral system, the red on that little circle, the red is enteric fermentation. So how much of the greenhouse gas coming from those systems is enteric fermentation versus as you move across to the right-hand side of the slide where you see the high input, high output systems where manure becomes a much bigger topic. That means we need different systems to address greenhouse gas emissions from different farming models. And here's just a sample of some of the types of interventions that we're starting to model that will have the most impact in each of these different systems. So in a low-yielding system, as I think several of our speakers have touched on earlier today, we need to look at issues like feed quality, animal health, animal husbandry, and indeed water quality as well. As you move across to the right-hand side, where we're thinking more about those high-yielding systems, topics like methane inhibitors, large-scale digesters become more important to us. So that's just a sample of some of the research that's going on. At COP27 this year, we'll be sharing much more detail on some of that information. But what I'd like to leave you with a thought on here is, as I said before, each country is represented by one of those blue dots. But no country is a single system either. So as we talk about how we implement pathways to dairy net zero, we need to do this level of analysis in each country, and often in each region in a country as well. So just talking now about the progress in emerging dairy economies, the challenge that was thrown on the stage by the Honourable Minister when he said we need to think about how we help emerging dairy economies to tackle greenhouse gas emissions as well. The Pathways to Dairy Net Zero initiative has been working very, very closely with the Global Methane Pledge, but also with the US State Department, with FAO, with IFAD, and with Cornell University. And we did an analysis of all dairy countries in the world and identified the top dairy countries in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions, particularly looking at methane. And out of that, we identified 10 countries across 3 regions, so Asia, the African continent, and Latin America, 10 countries that between them represent 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions from dairy. And we're now building a program with what we think of as early adopter countries. And I'll quickly take you through that. The idea behind this is to, as I say, identify these countries that are significant emitters of greenhouse gas. And then we've approached, through the US State Department, we've approached the governments in those countries. And right at the moment in Africa, we're working with 4 countries, with the governments of Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda. The first 3 have officially signed on to the program. The last one, Uganda, we're just waiting for approval. They've told us they're joining. We don't quite have approval yet. But for Africa, we've already started, led by FAO, in conjunction with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. We held a major workshop to look at how we would develop a concept note, as it's called, to go to the Green Climate Fund for funding for transformation of the dairy systems in those first 4 countries in the African region. That concept note, we are confident will go to not to FAO, it's gone there already, will go to the Green Climate Fund in the next few weeks, and we're hopeful to be able to announce during COP27 the progress that's been made in conjunction with the Green Climate Fund in that first region. The second region, the Americas, the countries we're working with there are Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Colombia. Now, Colombia, we haven't actually sent the letter to yet because we're still waiting post the election in Colombia for topics to settle down there. But both Uruguay and Costa Rica have signed on to this program already. And then I guess, as everyone in the room is waiting to hear, the Asian continent. And in Asia, we've written to, or I should say State Department has reached out to Pakistan, Vietnam, and India. Pakistan and Vietnam have already signed on, and India, there's the ongoing discussions. So it's a pity the minister isn't here, because I would have asked him for his commitment to support Pathways to Dairy Net Zero so that we could start the development of proposals for financing transformation in small-scale dairy farms within this country as well. So it's my pleasure to conclude our presentation today about Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, to tell you that as a dairy sector, as the IDF, as Global Dairy Platform and the other partners, we have a program very much aimed at action, not just talk, not just tools, not just methods, but action to help bring down greenhouse gas emissions in all of dairying around the world. And I thank you for your attention.
Such a pity the minister wasn't here, but the message will get there, I'm sure. and we'll demonstrate it through our actions and quantifiable actions. And I think that's important. The work we did on LCA, I speak with a lot of non-governmental organisations, and I just wish I could play back to them the recordings of the meetings that were held about how responsibly the dairy sector is acting in terms of trying to get the right methodology. It's not just about getting the lowest number. What methodology gives us the lowest number? It's what's the science say? How do we apply it appropriately as a responsible sector to demonstrate we're making improvement? So absolutely great program, and proud to be part of that. And the DSF will be the reporting component of that Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. So we have committed. We still will have a discussion session at the end, so please do think of your questions, and we'll take questions from the floor. But just before we do that, we're going to have a session on how National Dairy Development Board of India is looking to become carbon neutral and the work they're doing. So if I could please call to the table Mr. Attapalli, and if you could come and share with us what you're doing. Mr. Attapalli is a chartered accountant with over 20 years of experience in advising on renewable energy, energy efficiency, water consumption, and carbon asset development. He's based in Hyderabad state of Telangana. I hope I got that right. Please, update us.
Yeah. Dignitaries on the dais, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. So my presentation is basically how NDDB is taking action in making its headquarters carbon neutral. Basically a case study, little different from the speeches what you have heard so far. Next slide, please. This one, okay, thank you. Yeah. So we have been asked to work out how NDDB can achieve carbon neutrality for its headquarters. It was given to us in the month of March. We have conducted the study, completed the study, also submitted the document to the NDDB. Basically, carbon neutrality refers to a state in which the net amount of carbon dioxide emitted in the atmosphere is reduced to zero by actions to reduce or offset the emissions. This is done in two ways. One is, first of all, what kind of reductions can be brought, and after reduction still there is a balance, how do you offset them? This is how the neutrality is achieved. I'll see that this topic is getting very important world over. For your information, Indian Railways